Hello, and welcome to the Future of Work and HR stream at CogX 2021. The sessions and the stage today have been curated by the Institute for the Future of Work. Please do get involved by asking questions through the chat function in Hopin and by starting a conversation through social media, whatever your poison, Twitter, LinkedIn. The hashtag is CogX 2021 and the @ is Future of Work Inst. That's @Future of Work INST. Now, I hope you're comfortable for this next panel because it's filled with thought leaders looking at how we design technology for a better future of work. Now, the Institute for the Future of Work really looks at the macro level of how to help the inclusive design of the future of work. And at the micro level, looking at how technology design and development shapes the future of work, both different aspects of designing technology and both equally as important. What the Institute has found that really enables this is innovation challenges. So the Future of Work Challenge at InnovationRCA, who you will hear from later on in the panel, in collaboration with the Institute of the Future of Work's predecessor, the Future of Work Commission, Unlimited and Our Place in the World, created this innovation challenge, of which two of the winners were Sarah Davidson, founder of Enroll Yourself, and Harrison Moore, founder of Earwig, who you will hear from in the panel, hopefully discussing this innovation challenge and more. Right now, I'm going to bring in the moderator for the session, who is Abigail Gilbert, principal researcher at the Institute of the Future of Work. Hi, Abby, how are you doing?
Hi, I'm good. Thank you for the intro, Nadia.
Thanks very much.
Great. So, hello, welcome to a session I'm personally very excited about, exploring the role of design in building a future of better work. So before I kick off, I just want to reinforce the point that Nimi's made about the need, you're invited to tweet, and that's at Future Work Inst is us, but also CogX. And do send in any questions that you have for our brilliant lineup of speakers that cross practical experience through to the philosophy of this whole agenda of design and human-centered design. So by all means, please do send in questions through the platform. So I'm Abigail Gilbert. I'm the principal researcher at the Institute for the Future of Work, where we consider the impact of technology on the lived experience of work at an individual level, at a collective level, and also how it impacts work at the kind of broader scale of labour markets. So our recent work, a publication titled An Amazonian Era, How Algorithmic Systems Are Eroding Good Work, explored the increased use of algorithmic systems to manage the workforce through COVID. And it really found that the deployment of technology in the workplace can often be to the detriment of work quality and human experience rather than its betterment. So short of creating a better future of work, at the moment, technology deployment is often creating a worse living reality of work. So as an organisation, we make reference to the design environment to think about the various forces at play, which I suppose shape decisions about how technology is designed and deployed. But we also draw on design thinking as a very specific methodology and process, which was developed directly with one of our honoured guests today, to develop solutions and interventions which seek to better serve workers, which seek to kind of mitigate these forces that are perhaps meaning that technology is being deployed in ways which are eroding work quality. So we have an absolutely excellent lineup for this session with Nadia Danhash, who is the Director of InnovationRCA, where she was responsible for the overall development and commercialisation of Royal College of Art Intellectual Property, and also runs the InnovationRCA Incubator, as Nimi mentioned, which incubates design-led startups. And it was the first Future of Work challenge with InnovationRCA, which was set up with the Institute for the Future of Work's predecessor, which was the Commission on the Future of Work, so a parliamentary commission on the future of work. It was that first Future of Work challenge with InnovationRCA, which formed Earwig, which we also have the great pleasure of having Harrison Moore, who founded Earwig, with us today and went through that process. So Harrison is a former electrician who is now on a mission to use technology to make gig work really work for tradespeople everywhere. And that's obviously clearly hugely important, as in many ways trade work is the original gig economy. And so hopefully we'll get a chance to really get insight into how design as a methodology helped Harrison to forge this enterprise and this world-changing mission that he is on. And last but by no means least, we have Professor Jeremy Myerson. So Jeremy is a leading international academic researcher, author and activist in people-centered design and innovation based in London. He holds the Helen Hamlyn Chair of Design at the Royal College of Art and joined Unwired in October 2015 to set up the WorkTech Academy, a global knowledge network looking at the future of work. He's published more than 20 books on different aspects of design and innovation. His most recent titles include Time and Motion and The Life of Work. Jeremy supported the development of IFA's Social Policy Innovation Accelerator, which is the method that we use to engage different parties in thinking through a design process to make technology geared better towards the interests of workers. And that is available for download on our website. So also, please keep your eyes peeled as Jeremy is shortly releasing a book called Designing a World for Everyone, which will be out soon. So to kick us off, perhaps, Jeremy, what is design thinking? How could it help us create a future of better work? Over to you.
Well, thank you, Abby. Design thinking in its most basic form is simply about people-centered innovation. It's about placing the citizen, the worker, the person who's going to be using design at the center of the process, and not putting the producer, the employer, the government institution at the center of the process. And in order to do that in terms of thinking about how you design, you're looking at business problems, at societal problems through a different lens. You're looking at it through the lens of how can you, instead of leaving design of technology, for example, to the experts, you have a process where anybody can join that process, whether they're policymakers or social scientists. You don't have to have a design training to get involved in the process. And so design thinking is very simply a methodology. We didn't invent it at the Royal College of Art, but we've been quite instrumental in developing it and working with different organizations like the Institute for the Future of Work in order to embed it in their own organizations. And it's a way of really getting to the heart of problems and really understanding what the real issues are, rather than working off a series of base assumptions, which a lot of business and technology does.
Brilliant. That's a great introduction. I suppose just to follow on from that, Nadia, I wondered, how does this kind of concept get turned into practice in the InnovationRCA Challenge?
Well, the idea behind the challenge was we're used to working with designers who come from all walks of life, where they might be engineers, they might be clinicians, they might be artists, in the case of Harrison, an electrician. But we're used to giving them a training in design, and we're used to them saying, well, here are the problems in my sector or in my space, or here's a problem that bugs me and drives me mad. It's wrong. The way we solve it is wrong. I'm going to come up with a better solution. And that's what we call innovation-driven, passion-driven innovation and entrepreneurship. And, a group of us got together and said, what is the future of work, and why don't we harness the brains of our graduates to see what ideas they come up with for the future of work. So we ran a challenge. We had about 30 people took part. We mentored them over a few months. Harrison was one of them. Zara was another. Zara's interest was in lifelong learning and how do we make education accessible to everyone in an affordable way. And Harrison was specifically looking at the construction sector. And so through this challenge, at the end of the challenge, I said about 30 people went through it. Harrison and Zara both decided, right, we're going to incorporate and set up a business to really realize this solution. And so we've gone on to support them with that. But basically, they're the driving force. And it's, as Jeremy said, it's about looking at all the stakeholders and understanding the challenges facing each of those stakeholders. And putting the lens on them, and then coming back to come up with a solution that will be working for everyone.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Nadia. And just to touch on, if anyone's tuning in from Grimsby, we're big fans of Enroll Yourself, the other innovation that came out of this first Future of Work Innovation RCA, and are sponsoring some scholarships with their peer learning program there. So do get in touch if you can do that. So I suppose to just give this a little bit more grounding in, like, what does this really look like, and what can you do with it? Harrison, do you want to tell us a little bit about how this design thinking process shaped the intervention that you're making and what that actually looks like in practice?
Yeah, absolutely, I'd love to. So the first thing to say is that I had a bit of an, I would probably call it an untraditional route into this. So I started life as a tradesperson. That's what most kids in my school did when they left. It wasn't until I was 25 that I actually decided, you know what, I want to go to art school. That's what I've always wanted to do. So I was lucky enough to be working down in London on the Olympic Village. I chose to go to art school. Art school changed my life, right? It gave me everything. It gave me new ideas, time, space, resources, support, more confidence that I needed to sort of stand back and take a look at the problems that I'd experienced as a construction worker, and particularly as a contingent construction worker, because I'd, in order to sort of pay for university, I had to sort of continue working as an electrician, and you know, during sort of evenings, weekends, and during school holidays. And for that, I needed recruitment agencies, and that's where my sort of my experience of getting work through recruiters really began, and I've done that for about 6 years. So my route into it was through art school. Earwig began as an art school project, and grew legs. I was invited to be part of the InnovationRCA, and really that's when my sort of education, if you like, in design thinking and just sort of building initiatives with impact began. What does it look like in everyday practice? I mean, save for the pandemic, which has meant that we've now got a temporary office somewhere else. For me, it meant going into the same place that I would go for the years preceding getting into that program, and building stuff as quickly and cheaply as possible, getting feedback on it as early as possible, and basically embedding those insights and those learnings back into the product to just constantly iterate it. So that I think that idea of getting out of the building and speaking to people as soon as you possibly can, for me came quite naturally, but it's something that I know some people have to learn, and I'm certainly on that learning curve myself. But I couldn't have done what I'm doing today without going to art school. It's funny that this is sort of a design thinking seminar, because if you go to art school, you sort of know that there's quite an interesting relationship between artists and designers. They tend to not want to be associated with one another. But I happen to think that every artist becomes a designer as soon as they know what they want to build. So my art school training prepared me brilliantly for this, actually. And 3 years later, I'm just hiring my first team, and things are really ramping up, and it's an incredibly exciting time for me. So
that's great. And I wondered if you could just touch on, before we perhaps come back to Jeremy, to talk a little bit about a little bit more about the process, and I suppose this balance between stakeholders and non-expert, and how this gets into changing the kind of dynamics between a group of people when they're thinking about how to make an intervention. Could you say, Harrison, just a little bit about what Earwig does and how that's intervened in the space? So I think that will give us good grounds to then think about how power dynamics can be altered by the kind of things that have gone through this process, and also if you can touch on how it was shaped by the process to look as it does today, that would be great.
Yeah, well, to take your questions one after the other. So your last question, how is it shaped? I mean, it shaped everything I've done. I mean, I didn't have any of the skills, any of the sort of knowledge or the insights or strategies that you need in order to build something like this before I entered InnovationRCA. So they've basically given me everything from how to build business models, think about finance, right the way through to hiring, culture building, and all the way through to the coalface of like actually how to build stuff and how to get the right people on board. In terms of what we're trying to do, it's very simple actually. We're not trying to reinvent the wheel. We're not sending people to the moon. We're simply using technology solutions that knowledge workers take for granted, and we're applying them to the construction space to give them to tradespeople who until now haven't had access to those tools. So we're talking about things like reviews and ratings of your employer or your site. We're talking about crowdsourced information, which just basically creates a lot more a lot more knowledge for people to make decisions from. I've drawn a little diagram to show you a map of the ecosystem in construction in case there's anybody in the audience that doesn't quite understand how it works. Construction is one of the oldest gig industries in the world. It's fragmented into long cascading supply chains. If you can see this diagram, what I'm showing here is that each construction project is managed by a main contractor, and on that one site, the main contractor can have up to 50 or well, between 50 and 70 subcontractors that are taking care of individual aspects of the work, like scaffolding or electrics, for example. Now, each of these contractors has their own direct employees, but they also have and make use of agency workers on a regular basis. So each agency worker has a recruitment agency, of which there are thousands in the ecosystem, and each agency now outsources the payroll to a third-party payroll company, and of which there are hundreds. So each construction worker on every new job, which lasts about 8 weeks on average, is dealing with a new payroll company, a new agency, a new employer, and a new construction site. So what we're doing is we're just giving construction workers the technology solutions so that they can anonymously and safely give feedback about all aspects of their working conditions. And our big theory of change, if you like, is that there are certain main contractors who will want to work with us and incorporate this tool into all of their sites, for which we'll be able to give them a sort of accreditation certificate or some sort of proof that they're demonstrating that they care about everybody on their sites. And our big bet is it is our riskiest hypothesis, and it's the one that me and Ben are going to be testing next. Our biggest bet is that there are enough clients out there that would look favourable on a main contractor who could demonstrate that they're using Earwig. Because if we can do that, if we can get the likes of government or private developers to actually start choosing main contractors who have an Earwig score over contractors who don't, then we're talking, real system change. Mm-hmm. So I hope that gives you a bit more of an understanding about what we're doing.
Absolutely, I think that's really helpful to give us a kind of practical example to base the conversation around. And I think what's clear there from your diagram, well prepped in advance, is the sort of complex set of power dynamics and institutional arrangements that are often in place and shaping outcomes in the workplace. And I suppose your key intervention there was around looking at that landscape and thinking, well, what we can do is reduce some of the information asymmetries that disadvantage workers and use technology as a bridge in that. So I suppose there had to be a kind of narrowing to get to that aspect of the problem to then come into the particular design of the. So I wondered whether or not, Jeremy, you might be able to say something more around how the process and the sort of the philosophy of the process and the nature of the process allows you to identify something that you can sink your teeth into as the beginning of tackling what are often these kinds of complicated landscapes that we find in terms of problems in the workplace.
Yeah, I was very struck by what Harrison said, especially the relationship between artists and designers. And I'm reminded of the famous quote from the graphic designer Alan Fletcher, who said that artists solve their own problems and designers solve other people's. And I think that's quite a good analogy. The other thing I'd say about what Harrison has done is he's intervened in a complex system. You called it a complicated landscape. The construction industry is, what researchers would call a complex socio-technical environment. And it's very difficult to untangle. And the whole point about design thinking is that it stops the kind of mentality that exists in many companies around innovation projects. They tend to be linear. People tend to go into groupthink. They tend to lock very early onto a solution, and it becomes a linear process to roll out this solution, whether or not it's solving the right problem. What design thinking does, it in a sense slows down the process. It goes initially into a deep dive into the problem. It brings, as Nadia said, all the stakeholders in. People are allowed to think divergently around the issue, when actually we know that in a lot of organizations, convergent thinking is the thing that's rewarded, and divergent thinking is the thing that is punished. So there is a series of phases where you're moving between convergent and divergent thinking, you're iterating, and you're spending far more time on the problem and the basic issues and getting as many voices into the dialogue as possible, so that you get a much more rounded view of the problem. And I think that trying to intervene in something as complex as the subcontracting on a construction site is a very good example of where you've really got to look at this through a different lens. And, you know, I was reading the report, the Amazonian era, and the two things that struck me that I found kind of depressing was there's a move from a culture of trust to a culture of proof, and because of the use of algorithms and data. And workers are becoming more pessimistic about the value of their work and the value of technology than they were previously. And we need to reverse that. And to reverse it, we've got to put a new set of lenses on the problem.
I think that leads really nicely into a conversation around, and I suppose picking up on your reflections on Harrison's comment about artists and designers being people that solve other people's problems. Is design a tool that we should be putting in the hands of workers, or is design a process that we should be kind of taking workers through, do you think? I'm thinking here, we recently used the design thinking methodology that you helped us to develop, Jeremy, with a union to sort of begin a conversation around how they might reduce information asymmetries in the workplace, and also make employers more aware of the risks of technologies that they're deploying. So I suppose, does design thinking work best when there is, you sort of said it's a non-expert process, does it work best when you hand it to the people that have the problem to find a method of solving it, or is it something that's better mediated by a kind of designer?
I think it's better mediated. I think the model needs to be understood. But the whole point is that it's more democratic. Just handing it over, and there's a lot of suspicion, quite rightly, in workforces, in unions, that design, which has traditionally been seen as part of mass production, mass markets, and so on, you know, how can that solve power imbalances in the workplace? But it's a way of solving problems. I think mediated workshops, mediated processes, I think that's the way forward.
Makes sense. Nadia, in your perspective, and I suppose also as a trustee of the Institute for the Future of Work, to what extent do you think design thinking is currently serving the goal of the future of better work? Do you think this is the better work is a focus of the design thinking agenda?
I think we're starting to see a lot of designers looking at the world of work and saying, this could be better, and I know how to make it better, combining design approaches with the use of technology. We have, for example, a couple of interesting startups that we're working with. One is a company called Nod, which is looking at using artificial intelligence to improve employee training. But it's in their words, it's sort of, they would say they're hyper-personalizing the way that people learn, the way different individuals learn. But they're using technology to do that. But the end result is that people learn, so their career development and career progression and ability to adapt as the world of work changes is made more feasible and more successful. And another company that's also set up by a service designer is looking at speech technology. So we're increasingly using speech. We will all be using speech more. But again, very much turning the lens on not the technology, but actually on the users. How do I, as a company, using speech technology, want to be able to best utilize the technology? And how do my customers want to best be able to use the technology? So I think there's definitely more interest from designers to solve these problems. and come up with better solutions than we have already. So yeah, I'm quite optimistic.
Great. And in any of your experiences, I suppose, has there been a, when, I suppose, in a lot of policy and legislation around promoting the good experiences of work in relation to data-driven technologies, or good experience of technology, it's very much focused on consumers rather than workers. Are there different considerations that we need to think about when we're sort of thinking about deploying design for the ends of improving work experience as opposed to, I suppose, system experience? So I leave the floor open on that one.
Well, I'm happy to jump in on that. Yes, there are different approaches. I mean, I think a lot of legislation around consumer protection is much stronger than worker protection, and there are fears that worker protection will be eroded further. And often it's not that companies, are inherently unfair and they want to give people a bad deal. They're just unaware of the power imbalances and the biases that are being brought in by technology. This idea that technology is some neutral, unbiased force in the workplace. Technology is only as biased or unbiased as the people who are writing the software, and the people who are commissioning the systems. So we have to think very carefully about how we create the conditions for safer, fairer work. And again, I come back to the Amazonian era report. You've got a good work charter, and number 9 is participation. Everyone should be able to take part in determining and improving working conditions. Companies are generally, I'm director of something called Work Tech Academy, so I have a lot to do with large organizations who are trying to reimagine their workplace. They're interested in workforce participation, in the redesign of the physical environment, but they don't know how to go about it. And design thinking methodologies are one way, not the only way. It's not a magic bullet, but it's a way to bring people into a serious, engaged process to reimagine what the physical work environment could be like. So I think that's one example, the redesign of the physical work environment, where there's an opportunity to use these processes to make the workplace work better for more people.
Mm-hmm. And so I suppose building on that, what conditions do you think need to be in place to make I suppose from the variety of experiences that you've had through the Academy, what makes for a workplace where this works well, do you think? What are the conditions that need to be in place for a design thinking process once you've got all the stakeholders in the room for it to turn into something that actually has meaningful impact?
Well, if you look at the academic literature around all of this, there's a concept in environmental psychology called a sense of control. And that is the single biggest factor, the single biggest determinant of whether people feel they are treated fairly at work, whether they are comfortable at work, whether they feel respected and valued at work. Loss of control is the number one thing, and I'm sure that Harrison can relate to that, having been in the fragmented construction industry. And a design thinking process can help understand why control has been eroded, how a sense of control can be restored. And we can use a process where people are coming together, researching ideas, generating solutions, evaluating those solutions, and looking how they might be delivered and scaled up. And it is a process which it doesn't run along straight lines, but it is a methodology that you can follow, and it allows quite intangible issues like loss of control in the workplace or loss of agency over your working life. It allows an intangible thing like that to be addressed in a tangible way.
Absolutely, and I think we've definitely seen that in our own practice and deployment of this, and I definitely advocate for that. So, Harrison, perhaps just coming to your experience and thinking about that journey from the initial moment of quite conceptual design thinking through to the delivery of something, what do you think are the pieces of the puzzle that need to be in place for design thinking to lead to impactful change?
It's a tough one, because I feel like I don't have a really conclusive answer to that, because I know from my own experiences, like I needed time and space, which a lot of people just don't have, right? Like I was lucky enough to get to go to art school, where I was given all of those resources and where I felt I could mobilize those resources myself to like make a different way of life possible for me. I'm not really sure how possible it is for most construction workers out there who are probably overworked and underpaid and tired and like you said, especially in this fragmented sort of ecosystem they're in. I think that there's a they sort of know that the way of life is possible, but knowing how to make that way of life possible is a different thing entirely. I stopped short of saying universal basic income for everyone, because I don't know enough about that yet. I only know surface level, and it sounds like a great idea in theory, but how it would work in practice, I'm not really sure. For me, I think the more people who can go into education feeling like education is a good thing, like it's a lifelong thing, and it's not just something you choose to do, for one small period of your life when you're a teenager, I think the better. I do think that we still have too much of a separation even at primary school, maybe, or secondary school, definitely, between academic and non-academic, or smart and non-smart people. That's a problem. These are big problems. I don't have the answers to them, but I suspect that the answer lies there somewhere. I do think it's getting. I don't want to be like a pessimist. I think more and more people are getting more and more access to more and more useful knowledge, right, through the internet, for example. So that's bound to be a great thing. And I think the optimist in me thinks that, for as many negative consequences that come out of technology, surely there has to be as many positive consequences, or as many people using it positively. That's probably my optimistic message, or my hope, I would say.
That's great, thank you. I suppose.
Sorry. No, I was just going to say, it feels as though we're on a journey of democratizing things, and we're a long way from being at the target, but technology has certainly played a role in for example, access to data. And I'm thinking about, for example, the government.gov website. That well-designed technology has put information in the hands of the public in a way that's accessible. Okay, there'll be some bits that are not great, but largely it has removed barriers to people accessing information. Public information, which wouldn't have been there before. So with technology, with good design, can achieve great results. I guess that's, and that's the better for all of us with work. So it's just what I wanted to add.
That makes sense. And I wondered if I could just follow on from that by asking, I suppose, in your work with various organisations that are, or I suppose through the InnovationRCA challenge, what do you think are the ingredients that make a design intervention work when to get off the ground? I suppose I'm thinking about this in the context of us seeing, at the moment, obviously landscapes of investment in technologies then tend to follow ideas which maybe are depleting of agency and control in the workplace. And definitely the Amazonian era kind of revealed to us that a lot of those who are engaged in technology design aren't thinking in maybe the kind of philosophies and ways that we would expect would lead to a kind of approach that might lead to a more human-centered kind of outcome. So how do we, I suppose, to everybody, how do we start that conversation? What do you think needs to happen to make this kind of approach, this human-centered approach, more wide-reaching and also across the tech kind of sector, which is developing some of the tools that are changing these kind of environments? Is that the right place for the conversation to happen? Could it happen somewhere else? Just open to the floor.
I can just say one quick thing about my about my actual experiences at, you know, where the tire meets the road. For me, the language that we use to talk about it is really important, because like I've always sort of had a sense that like some language excludes people and, you know, some includes people. Fine, like, everybody sort of tends to know that. I think Orwell's written about that brilliantly. But I've really experienced a huge difference in how receptive tradespeople are to what we're trying to do, just by changing the words I'm using to describe it to them. So I think that's a really important part of this jigsaw, is like, let's communicate in a language that a 6-year-old person can understand. Yeah, sorry, that's just my 2 pence on that bit.
Fair enough. And go on, Nadia, sorry.
Yeah, no, the other thought is, in a way, certainly in the sort of world that I inhabit, where I'm working more with founders and early stage companies, to a certain extent, what is driving change is actually investors, because investors want to see their investments succeed. And they're beginning to recognize that the companies that are impactful are the ones that actually have a well-rounded solution. And that well-rounded solution comes from understanding the users and understanding the stakeholders. So to a certain extent, it's being driven in that way. But obviously not all investors are as aware, but some are. So.
And so, Jeremy, just to come finally to you, you've sort of touched on the fact that you don't know whether or not is design thinking a panacea. Who would you see using design thinking more? And if you wanted them to be using other processes, what might they be?
Well, I think everyone should use design thinking processes more. And that, you know, everybody, you know, industry trade bodies, unions, large employers. I know that one of the big early adopters of design thinking were financial institutions after the global financial crash, so they could assess risk better. And I know they're doing a lot of work around customer journeys and then more recently employee journeys. So, you know, a lot of organizations that have brilliant customer service and give the consumer, you know, treat them fairly, with great respect, with great attention to detail, they don't do the same for their own workers. And what I'm seeing in the WorkTech network is a switch from seeing employees as employees to as employees as in a consumerized workplace, as customers for the kinds of services that the IT department, that the HR department, that the facilities department offer. And that's a very interesting sea change, because what's happening in the workplace, I mean, construction is one of those industries, along with agriculture, where, you know, although there's a lot of knowledge in those industries, they're not where knowledge workers who can easily work remotely reside. But what's happening with the pandemic is that suddenly, for a lot of people in jobs where formerly they went to a workplace every day, some of that job, it can now be done remotely or in a third space or in the home. And so people have a choice. So that in a sense, they've been consumerized by the condition of the last 18 months. And what's happening is that people organizations are now starting to see their employees as customers for workplace facilities. And that's a welcome sea change. And that makes me feel optimistic. Because once you treat employees as having a choice and some agency, then your mentality changes. And I think design processes are design thinking processes are important in all of that area. The whole point about design thinking is that it's a participatory process rather than an expert process. You might have an expert facilitating with a very light touch, but what it's about is participation. And that's what we need in the workplace if we're going to have fairer conditions.
I can just echo Jeremy's thought about employee onboarding, because I've just gone through the process of hiring a team for the first time. It's the first time I've ever done anything like that, and of course, I wanted to do a good job of it. And so as soon as I started researching online about how to onboard employees, I came across so much literature and so much development in that area that I actually thought, oh wow, there's a whole science and an art to now onboarding staff and keeping them happy. So the best companies out there treat their staff as well as their customers, and it's now if I'm trying to hire a software developer, I've got to be realistic about the type of work environment I'm creating for that person, when they could go down the road and probably earn twice as much as what I can pay them from any of the big 4 tech companies. So I think in a strange way, that's the kind of mentality that we're trying to foster amongst main contractors, right? Because there's a skills shortage in construction, as there is in many other sectors, worsened by Brexit and pandemic. And so, it's now a workers' market for the first time in a long time. So it's a great opportunity for us to find forward-thinking clients and contractors who actually want to start treating workers well, because ultimately, from the workers' perspective, there's always another job down the road. Why should we stay on your project? So I just wanted to make that connection between what Jeremy said and what we're trying to do. I think it is a really important sea change.
Concluding comments. Sorry, I think I was muted there. I was just going to say, Nadia, did you have anything that you wanted to say before?
Only that I'm optimistic about the future. I think that we're moving in the right direction. Yes, bad things happen, but in general, I think in a way, particularly in the UK, there is quite an open-mindedness. People are interested in working across disciplines, and I think that exposure to realizing the value and knowledge that can come from other sectors that might be useful, I think that in itself will help us solve some of the knottier problems that we are challenged with.
Brilliant. Well, thank you all for what's been a really rich and fascinating conversation around the role of design in building a future of better work. It's been great to have such a breadth of consideration, from should we have universal basic income so that we can all become artists or designers to solve the problems of the world of work, due to some really rich and interesting conversations around how design thinking is currently being deployed in workplaces to the benefit and advantage of workers. I think there's also some really rich discussions to be had, again, in the future around the place of design and processes of democratization of the technology at work. And obviously, we've kind of had hint from the panelists that we think that we're moving in the right direction, but very slowly. And as an institute, moving in the right direction, the first pieces are in play, but we need to encourage this to go further. And as an institute, we're definitely interested in keeping the conversation going around how we get the environment and the environmental conditions in place for those kinds of impetuses, the kind of desire to consult your workforce, or the requirement to consult your workforce to be more widely recognised, so that these kinds of methodologies for beginning conversations can take place, and also can interplay with some other more kind of technical aspects of building a future of work, building a future of better work in an age of technology, for instance, around algorithmic auditing and engaging in some of these kinds of techie transformations of the workplace. So thank you once again to all of the speakers, and to CogX for hosting us here today.
Great, thank you so much to all the panelists. Right now, we're going to break for lunch, but we'll be back at 2 p.m. exploring trends for the future of work. So make sure you're back here on this channel at 2 p.m. Huge thanks to the Institute of the Future of Work.